Okay, so all ready to go. So hi everybody. Thanks everyone for joining in. Really excited that Clare Mackintosh is joining us, and also really excited that Karina Kilmore, one of our associated authors for Global Girls Online Book Club, is joining me to help me interview Clare. So for those who don't know, Karina is the debut author of Where the Truth Lies, and and is involved in our group with reviews and interviews, which is really, really great. So for those who don't know Clare, Clare has...
Which is nobody,
Yeah,
because everybody does.
exactly, yeah. So Clare has more than 2 million copies of her books sold worldwide, and she's a multi-award winning author of I Let You Go, which was the Sunday Times bestseller and the fastest selling title by a new crime writer in 2015. And both of Clare's second and third novels, I See You and Let Me Lie, were #1 Sunday Times bestsellers. And for those who haven't been involved in our group for that long, you might not know, but I See You was actually our second book club read for Global Girls Online Book Club. And Clare very kindly answered some of our questions and sent us some videos, which was great for when we were only just starting as well. So that was really, really good. So Clare's latest thriller is Hostage, which was published in June. And I was just saying to Karina, I've been reading it and I'm really disappointed that I have only got 30 pages left and I haven't quite finished reading it before I was able to do this interview. But very, very close to finishing it and really, really loving it so far, as much as I've loved your other books. So thanks again, Clare, for joining us. Great to have you. Would you like to start off, Clare, maybe by telling us a little bit about Hostage?
Yeah, sure, I'd be glad to. So Hostage is a locked room thriller set on the first ever non-stop flight from London to Sydney. So it's really nice to be here, talking to people all around the world, but especially in Australia. So the concept for this book came from a couple of things, but one of them was the fact that this London-Sydney non-stop flight is scheduled to start. So we already fly direct from London to Perth, but the longest flight is going to be London-Sydney, and it should have happened last year, I think. But
I
something
think
put a
they did
stop
a
to it. I
trial.
can't
Did they
imagine what
do a
that was.
trial? They did a trial one, didn't they?
They have.
Yeah.
They've done a trial. And so I was reading loads about this trial and how kind of extraordinary it was. And I thought it felt like a really good setting for a locked room thriller. So in this book, we follow Mina, who is a flight attendant, and she's on this inaugural flight. And we follow her husband, Adam, who's at home looking after their 5-year-old daughter, Sophia. And soon into the journey, Mina receives an anonymous threat from somebody on the plane. She doesn't know which passenger or member of staff it is, but somebody wants that plane taken over and wants Mina's help. And Mina has to make a terrible decision. Does she go along with the demands and keep her family safe because her family are under threat, or does she keep her family safe but sacrifice everyone on the plane? And that's basically the premise of the thriller.
And I know things changed, but were you planning to try and go on a flight like that?
I really wanted. I mean, to be honest, I could never have justified it as a kind of, like a business expense, because to be honest, one long flight is much like another. And I think the longest flight I've done is 13 hours. And that gives you enough, because what fascinates me about ultra long haul is the fact that you're basically living a whole day, a whole day and a whole night. You get up and you eat and you work and you watch TV and you go to sleep, and you do all of that with complete strangers. And I find it such a weird concept that here we are, even on a shorter flight, and you're going to sleep and you're literally like that far away from someone else who's asleep. I don't sleep that close to my husband, It's such a weird thing to do. And I love that. And I love the fact that you mostly do that in silence. You know, you can be on a flight for 13 hours and not speak to the person next to you and not know their story, and it's just rich territory for a writer.
That was one of the things that interested me most, Claire, is that it's sort of like a high action thriller premise, but reading the story, it's actually like a character study as well. It's almost like a domestic thriller.
Absolutely, and that's what I write. You know, I write books that are rooted in ordinary people, in situations that are, you know, out of the ordinary. So I'm much more interested in the dynamics of relationships and families, and you know, parenthood, and relationships with our partners, and all my books have focused on those sorts of things. So although Hostage, you're absolutely right, the premise is essentially an action thriller, and I could have written this book as an action thriller and just focused on, you know, the really exciting bits and the adrenaline pumping, and perhaps had, you know, air marshals and like sexy figures. But that's not what I do, and it's not what I'm interested in, because you know who's going to win. You know, if you've got an air marshal and they're your kind of your hero, and you've built them up to be something really cool, and they get into a fight, like, you know they're going to win. Whereas if you've got a housewife from suburbia, you know, or you've got Mina, just a flight attendant, actually the odds are stacked against them, and so it's much more exciting, and it's much more relatable, because most of us can't relate to being James Bond, but we can relate to, you know, working as, I don't know, a flight attendant or a secretary or someone in a shop who suddenly finds themselves in peril.
And we know, a lot of us, I think, know that you have a police background. In your previous novels, the police force features quite a lot, I'd say, in some of your previous. Probably not quite as much this one, would you say?
No, absolutely. So this is the first novel. I mean, obviously, so I wrote After the End a couple of years ago, which isn't a crime thriller at all. It's I call it a family drama. You know, some people call it a medical drama, but it's got no police in it at all. And this isn't a police procedural. It has a link to it, because Adam is a police officer, but we meet him at work, but we don't see him working as a police officer. But the fact that he is a police officer is very, very important to the story, and has a bearing on it for reasons that we won't talk about. But what I wanted to do, and what was interesting to me, was to write about a police officer as a person, because when we read these books, these procedurals, sometimes we see police officers coming home, and you know, we have the stereotypes of their troubled marriages and their struggles with drink, and you know, all the tropes, all of which are rooted in reality, in my experience. But what we don't see is what's that person like in their real life, and how do they handle conflict in their real life. And so that's what we get with Adam. We get the behind the scenes of a cop at home.
And could you tell us what sort of research you had to do for Hostage?
Loads and loads. And the person that I'm indebted to is actually an Australian, who I can't name. I'm not allowed to name this person because they helped me so much that they were a little bit concerned they might have given me too much information. So I promised that I wouldn't name them, but I spent a long time on Skype with a pilot in Australia, and they were absolutely amazing, and you know, talked me through so much around the feeling of being in the flight deck, the feeling of flying a plane, which is something I had no experience of. So that was really great. I also spoke to lots and lots of flight attendants, spent a long time on looking at forums. Flight attendants are really indiscreet. I mean, cabin crew talk about so much stuff that I'm fairly confident they shouldn't online. And so that was really helpful for me to get a picture how they talk and the jargon they use and what sorts of things crop up in their everyday life. So that was good. I flew a flight simulator with my son. So I wanted to fly a Boeing 777, and with a simulator you can fly. I could land at Sydney Airport, which was a really cool thing to do, and I could choose the weather conditions to match them to the book and the time of day. And I had my son with me, who is 14 and quite good at computer games, and he flew really well and did a near perfect landing. And I crashed so horrifically badly. So that was interesting. So I did that. And what else did I do? I mean, lots of sort of personal research in terms of being on planes and observing people, and lots of people watching. And then the other big area of research, of course, was Sophia, who's 5 years old and is adopted. And I know quite a few people who have adopted children, and I know that there's an assumption that if you adopt a child when they're very young, so in the first 6 months of their life, that child will have no memory of where they came from, and it will be much simpler than adopting a child who's a few years old. And I also know from talking to friends of mine who have done this that is very far from the case. And I was really, Sophia is really inspired by a friend's daughter who, at the age of 8 or 9, gave her mother a hug for the first time. So the first time that this child had instigated physical contact. And I was really moved by this story, and I'm quite shocked. And my friend, was very, very generous and talked a lot about attachment disorder and about how if a baby spends many weeks crying and nobody comes, then that is a lifelong habit that you then form. That is a lesson that teaches them that the best thing to do is not to ask for affection, because it might not be returned. And that's heartbreaking, and a huge amount of love and work and commitment on the part of the parents. And so what I wanted to do in Hostage was tell a bit of that story. And although I don't know what it's like to have an adopted child, one of my children has autism, and affection is a really interesting thing. They don't always, my daughter doesn't always want someone to hold her, even when she needs me to hold her. So I know a lot about that, and I also know the strain that it can put on relationships. It's a difficult situation to have a child that has any kind of additional needs. So that's Sophia, and that is what happens in that household between Sophia and the relationship she has with each of her parents, and then the relationship they have with each other as a result of the way that they parent. And that has a huge impact on the story and how it unfolds.
Yeah. Can I take you back to after the end? For those who don't know, that's also part of your family's story, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, After the End is about two parents who disagree on the medical treatment that their critically ill son should have. So the situation they're presented with is, your son Dylan will have profound disabilities, global disabilities, that will severely impact on his quality of life. Do you continue to fight and give him experimental treatment and extend his life by a short amount with the restrictions that he will be living with, or do you remove him from intensive care and allow him to pass away? And these parents disagree, and they have to go to court. And so it's a moral dilemma book, but it's also a book about what happens after that trauma, and it's really about how we move on from terrible situations. And that is a decision that I had to make, my husband and I had to make, and we did agree. But it was inspired by a conversation that I had with the consultant, and I said, you know, you want us to make this awful decision. What if we can't agree? And she said, you have to agree, because the alternative is unthinkable. And so After the End is a book about the unthinkable.
Yeah. It's a beautiful story. It's just it's stayed with me since I've read it. I've never been able to let it go. But being a police officer or police investigator, that means you've been a storyteller all your life, really, in a way, because investigating is finding people's truth and finding the story behind crimes and everything. Would you agree? I know I've been a journalist until now. Similar sort of thing, you know, you're telling stories, even if you're not writing them, you're finding out people's stories. Is that what led you to be an author?
I don't think it led me to being an author, but storytelling is something that has been a part of my life forever, and has always been part of any job that I've had, and now certainly my process for weaving stories together and putting planning my novels, it is very similar to putting a case together, to sifting through reliable and unreliable narrators, and it's a very important part of policing. It's a very I think it's a very privileged position to be in, when you're taking a statement from a victim of crime, that you're literally choosing the words to put down for them, because you don't write down what they say verbatim. You are writing a representation of what they say. An awful lot of victims are not hugely articulate. Almost all victims don't start at the beginning. They don't give you a beginning, middle, and an end. Every single victim starts at the end with what's just happened. You know, I've been attacked. And your job as an investigator is to pull them right back and say, okay, let's take, you know, if you were attacked by someone you know, let's go right back. When did you meet this person? You know, how do you know them? What's your relationship been like? And you're building a story in the same way that you would do with a piece of fiction. So that, I think, taught me a lot of skills, and also was an amazing experience in understanding how fragile life is, and how thin the line is between a good, safe life and a bad or a dangerous life. And what I like to write about are those moments where we cross over from one to the other, where we make a choice that takes us in a different direction, or something happens to us that means we have to jump over to the dark side.
And that's interesting what you say about it starting at the end. When do you find that that's how you write? Do you know the ending when you start?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't always know exactly how it's going to end. I tend to know big twists, and sometimes books will start with a twist that I want to do. So I Let You Go is a good example of that. It was the twist that came first, and the story that I built around it. Let Me Lie was the same, whereas I See You was very different. I See You started with a concept. It started with the idea that we're all creatures of habit. We like to do the same thing every day because familiarity makes us feel safe. But paradoxically, it's that familiarity, that predictability, that actually makes us very vulnerable to being followed. And so I had no idea where the reveals and the twists might be until I started planning the story. With Hostage, again, it was very much like I See You. It was the premise and the concept, and I didn't know where it was going to go until I planned it out and I knew the characters. But even then, I thought I knew how it ended. And I wrote the book and I got to the ending, and it changed a couple of times in the draft. And then in I think the third draft, and I won't spoil it, and particularly, you know, I know that I know that you're, Jackie, not quite at the end yet, so don't worry, no spoilers. But I got to what I thought was the end, and I wrote the end, and then I suddenly realised that there was something else that was going to happen. And so it kind of has a double ending, and this eventual ending is so perfect for the person involved, and it's so perfect for the story. So I think it is my favourite ending to date.
I know, that's great to hear, and makes me want to keep finishing. As soon as I finish here, I'll be finishing it off. We do have a lot of people watching, which is great, and getting some questions through from some people. So I'll try and ask a few questions from people watching. Mary's wondering when and where you write.
Well, gosh, that is a good question, Mary. If you asked me that 2 years ago, I would have told you that I do most of my writing on aeroplanes, trains, in hotel rooms, and in cafes around the world when I'm away with work, and that when I'm at home, so I'm in my office at the moment, and if I just turn this around, you'll see my
and we love your wallpaper.
The wallpaper's great, isn't it? I love my wallpaper. So I'm in my office, and I'm in my this is like my Zoom corner. So if I'm having a meeting, then I'm at my desk. But if I'm doing an event, I tend to sit on the sofa here. So pre-pandemic, my office is where I did interviews and kind of admin-y stuff, and emails and all that. And I didn't do much creative writing here. And then, of course, everything has changed. And last year, I really struggled to write because I couldn't kind of get a hold of that creative space that I used to occupy in different places. So I've trained myself back into writing in an office, which is always what I used to do before I was lucky enough to travel around the world. And I try and be at my desk by kind of 9:30, maybe 10 o'clock, and I work until 6-ish. But I don't feel at the moment I have a great routine. The kids have been at home for a long time. They are back in school now. But everything's been so interrupted, and I'm not feeling particularly productive. I'm faffing around a lot. I sit at my desk to write and then spend an hour on Twitter instead. And I don't know about anyone else, but my focus has really been damaged by a year, 18 months of looking at breaking news and responding to things, and suddenly, oh my God, we're going into lockdown, oh, we're coming out of lockdown, those sorts of things. And I need to do a bit of maybe mindfulness or something to refocus. If anyone's got any tips, I'm going to come back in and look at the comments when we finish. So if you've got some top tips, then leave them in the comments. I'd be very grateful for them, how I can get my focus back.
I don't have any tips, but I have to agree. I'm completely addicted to the news cycle now. I need to know every little thing about COVID and what's happened, and is there anything I can do to help? It's sort of like, what's next? But do you think that your background, in a policing role, a disciplined role, does that automatically assume that you're a planner with your writing, or are you sort of like a pantser all of a sudden? How does that work?
No, I do plan. I think that's less about the police though, and just more about who I am as a person. I've always written lists. I've always been very organized. I've always wanted to have books neatly arranged on my shelf as a child. I never missed deadlines or was late handing in essays. I like to be organized, and I like to know what I'm doing. And I see writing books very much like, designing a house that I need to see the plans. I need to draw those plans before I can start writing, because otherwise I could end up with something, that doesn't look great. So I plan, and I spend quite a long time planning. A lot of it's going on in the background. So to give you an example, right now I'm obviously promoting Hostage, so that story is in my head because I'm talking about it at events. I am writing the third draft, so the final structural draft of next year's book, and I'm planning 2023's book. So they all those three things use different bits of my brain. I couldn't write two books at once, but I can be thinking about 2023's book. So I will think about that over the summer, and in August, when I've got to write a non-fiction book, that's when I'll start doing a chapter plan for 2023's thriller, by which time I'll be proofreading 2022's thriller. I think that's right. So again, different. So we move on to the next stage, but they're all very different. And then come September, I'll have my chapter breakdown. My non-fiction book will go in to be edited, and I will then write the first draft of 2023's thriller, and I won't do anything else while I'm writing that. So that first draft process is kind of all consuming. And I'll finish it by Christmas, and it will go to my editor, and then in the spring I will replot it, because I will have got stuff wrong and the pacing will be off, and then I'll write it again. So that's kind of what happens. So I plan and I write, and then I replan and I rewrite.
Sounds like you have to be very, very organised to do what you've mentioned.
Yeah, I think I have a whiteboard up to my right with a timeline on it, with the months, and it's a project plan, and so I've got projects that overlap, and as long as I stay on track with those, then it'll get done. I'm slightly overloaded at the moment, so this year feels a bit busy, but that's partly because I've taken on a non-fiction book, and it's partly because I am very, very keen to have a book out each year, which I haven't done to date. So After the End came out in 2019, the paperback came out last year, and now I've got a new book. So I've always had something out each year, but it hasn't been a new title. And I would very much like to have a book out each year.
And is there anything at all that you're able to share about what you're working on at the moment?
Sorry, my phone's just rung. I'm just going to put my phone on silent.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, and I don't know this for certain, but I'm hopeful it might be the start of a series. So I've not written a series before. I'd really love to, and the world that this book is set in could have lots of stories in it. So it's set in North Wales, which is where I live, and it's set in a community with a lake, and the border between England and Wales runs right through the middle of the lake. And on the Welsh side of the lake is a very small rural community, the sort of place where people have lived there for 12 generations, very, very local. And on the English side of the lake is a very, very luxury shishi resort of wooden cabins with decks overlooking, stretching over the lake. And on New Year's Day, the locals go into the water for their New Year's Day swim, which is very cold, of course, in this country. And a body floats through the mist from one side to the other. And so that's kind of the start. And there's a Welsh detective and an English detective, and they work on this murder investigation. But I really love it. I love the world. I love Fionn Morgan, who's my Welsh detective. And yeah, I think it might be. We'll see.
Sounds very intriguing.
Sounds sort of a bit Scandi noir, almost.
Absolutely, very, very. The Bridge, quite Scandi vibes, and a proper police procedural, which again is something I haven't really written. So I don't tend to write the same sorts of books. They've all got common themes, but the structure and the shape of them and the style varies from book to book. And then 2023's novel is pure thriller again, and that is about a woman who several years ago married a man on death row in a kind of moment of madness, and then broke off all contact, and now he's escaped. and it's, you know, what's that like? What does that feel like? And I'm so excited to write that, and I don't exactly know where that's going, but I've got some really good twists planned out, and I'm looking forward to the autumn when I can write it.
No, I can see that as one of your strong character stories as well. Even though the plot, you know, it sounds absolutely fascinating, I can also see how you would develop your characters in there. That's your love, really, isn't it? Or see, as a reader, that's how it comes across to me, your books.
Yeah, absolutely. It is my love, and it is, I think, the most important thing in writing, because you can have a really amazing, twisty story, but if you don't care about the characters, if you're not interested in them, then you're not going to keep turning the pages. And I'm learning that all the time. And actually, I Let You Go, it doesn't have it doesn't have my strongest characters, because it's something I'm kind of working on and evolving as I go through. And Writing After the End, which is a pure character-led book, taught me so much about character, and I think that's come through into Hostage, and just is going to get stronger now with every book.
Yeah, beautiful.
And Kelly has mentioned about your book club, and Mary about the Hostage Facebook page you had as well. That's something that really amazes me as an author, the time that you have to connect with your readers. Like, you seem to spend so much time with your book club, and then with starting that Hostage group as well. It was really, really amazing. How do you find time to do that? And
that's a bit of a problem, if I'm completely honest. I love it. I really love it. Love connecting with readers. I love chatting online. But going back to that conundrum I've got of how do I get better focus? How do I become more productive? The truth of it is that I'm working far too much, far too long. When my children were smaller, they gave me a structure. When they got home from school, I had to stop working. The older that they've got, so they're teenagers, they're 13 and 13 now, they either don't come home from school because they're playing sport, or they come home and they go out again, or they're at home and they don't need me. And so I just carry on working. And what that means is there's no real incentive to be strict about my time, because, well, I'll just work later, So I don't know what the answer is. Right now, I give as much as I need to give to chatting online to readers, and I'm not particularly good at capping that and thinking, actually, what I need to be doing is writing 2,000 words a day.
And probably when you started, did you ever think that the book club would have grown so much as it has?
No, and you'll know this from running an online community yourself. It's something that can take very little time or an awful lot of time. My book club has around 13,000 on the mailing list, and then the Facebook group is about 7,500, and it's very engaged and very chatty. I have 2 volunteer moderators, Sarah and Linda, who help manage membership and answer questions, and I genuinely couldn't cope without them. And I have a PA who helps me put newsletters together, and again, I couldn't cope without her. So I do have support. I'm not very good at leaning on people. I'm not very good at asking for help or outsourcing things, because ultimately this is me, and I want to be the one talking to readers. But wherever there are tasks that don't matter, if it's creating an image, that doesn't have to be me. That could be someone else. Whereas answering an email, that needs to be me.
And Ali has a good question. She says, does it get less fun and more like a normal job the more books you write?
That is a very good question. Yes, I think. I think people are always surprised by how much like a normal job it is, when they ask what my routine is. And I think maybe they want to hear something a bit more exotic than I sit at my desk Monday to Friday. I do my tax return. I answer emails. You know, I attend Zoom meetings. It really is like a normal job. And a lot of people ask. I'm staggered by how many people ask this exact question. Do you approach it like a job? And I'm like, it is literally my job. You know, that this is what pays my mortgage, what feeds my children. It is a job. What do you mean? Do I treat it like a normal job? And I think maybe what they mean is, do you work when you don't have to, or when you don't want to? And I do. You know, very occasionally I will say, oh, I just, you know, I can't be bothered. I don't want to do it today. But actually, mostly, I either say, okay, the writing isn't working well, so, you know, I won't write today, but I will do other stuff, and there's always stuff to do. Or I just say, okay, I'm not writing my best today, but I'm still going to write it. And it may well be that those words are more heavily edited, or actually I lose them entirely when it comes to reading through again. But if I was an accountant and I worked in an office and I didn't feel like working today, well, that's tough, you know. The vast majority of people around the world have to do their job, whether they feel like it or not. And, you know, sometimes we have great days and sometimes we don't, but you've just got to do it. And so from that point of view, I treat it like a job. Has it got less fun? In many ways it has, because the stuff around it has, you know, got more. And so, you know, working harder is often not quite as much fun. But the writing bit is a lot more fun because I'm better than I was when I started. And it's fun to think about how many countries around the world people are reading my books. Meeting people like you guys is fun. And of course, I never did that with my first book, because no one knows who you are. And so I'm just going to say yes and no for that one.
No, that's a good answer. And I've got another good question, but I'm going to pronounce this person's name wrong, I'm sure. I think it may be Gwefwell. And her question is, are you influenced by any certain authors in particular?
I'm really intrigued now as to who this person is. How do you spell their name?
Gwefyl.
Is that Irish?
Gwefyl.
Welsh?
Yeah, it looks like a Welsh name, yeah.
I'm going to go with that for Welsh. Right, sorry. So give me the question again, because I was distracted by the name.
How do you say it again? Could you please say it for me?
Well, I think it's Gwefyl.
Okay.
You're not going to try it now, are you?
Chicken.
Her question is, are you influenced by any authors in particular?
Lots and lots, all the time. You know, I read voraciously, and I'm always kind of absorbing things that they do. But it sort of changes, you know. So I love Ruth Ware, Lucy Foley, Lisa Jewell, lots of women writing really brilliantly about the sort of psychology of crime. And I really like that. Sophie Hannah was a big influence in terms of the structure of the book, because her Culver Valley series was the first time I'd encountered a police procedural that also told the victim's story. So, you know, first person woman talking about the jeopardy situation that she was in, but also an investigation. And I read it as I was writing I Let You Go, and trying to work out how to tell this story, because it didn't feel familiar. And then I read one of, it was Little Face that I read, and I realized that I could do that. That was okay to write from both points of view. So that was a huge influence.
And could you tell us what, like you said, authors who influence you, but I'm just wondering, do you have time to read much yourself? You seem to be so busy.
Yeah, I don't sleep very much. I do. I read every day. I only really read at night. I keep telling myself that I'm going to have, my dream is to have an hour at the end of each working day where I turn my computer off and I leave my desk and I move to the sofa and I read for an hour as part of my working day, because it is a legitimate, thing to do as part of my job. And I never do that. And the only time I've done it is when I was judging for the Costa Book Awards, when I had a huge number. I think I had 60 books to read in about 3 months. And so I had to make it part of my day. So I literally worked out how many, it takes me about an hour to read 100 pages. So I worked out how long it would take me to do that. And I, put it in my diary and did it. And I loved it. But I read between 80 and 100 books a year, I suppose.
Okay. So you're still reading a
really low for me. The year before I'd read 100, and then last year I think I read about 75, 80, which was, again, evidence of how my concentration had been affected. And so I don't know what I'll end up with this year. I don't keep a tally as a sort of score. I just write down the books that I read in a notebook.
And I'm wondering if there might be anything you have read recently that you'd like to recommend to us.
Yeah, I think I'm quite late to the party with this one, but I've just finished 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton, which is one of the most incredible books I've ever read. I think it's set in a school, quite an exclusive, quite a liberal experimental school in the grounds of a huge wood, and it's set in winter and the snow's falling outside, and there is a shooter on the school grounds. So obviously huge amounts of jeopardy for the teachers and the children. And it's just told, so it is a thriller, but it has so much heart, so much emotion. I listened to the audiobook and I had to pull over to listen to the last 20 minutes because I was so kind of choked up by what was happening. It was a really, really incredible story.
And I might be putting you on the spot by asking you this, but as you know, we're from Australia and we've got a lot of our members are from Australia. Are there any Australian authors that you love reading?
So Jane Harper, I think, is absolutely phenomenal. I read The Dry about a year or so, I think, after it came out, and was just, swept away by this incredible gift she has of putting you in that place. I've never been to Australia. I've never felt that kind of arid heat of a drought. And yet I absolutely felt I was completely there. So I think she is brilliant. Who should I read? Give me some names of Australian authors that I really should read.
Well, we will recommend Karina, who is one of our associated authors, of course. We have Nick Moriarty as well. So she writes some really, really great thrillers. Karina, I'm sure you can.
Gary Disher is one of my favourite crime writers in Australia. He's really fantastic. Michael Robotham is another one.
Yes, really, and he's got a new book out, hasn't he? I've met him in Harrogate at the Crime Writing Festival there, and I've met him and his wife, and he's such a nice guy.
And Christian White is another great Australian thriller writer as well.
Brilliant. I will address my deficit in Australian writers.
Well, Karina, have you got any more questions you wanted to ask?
I was just wondering, while we're talking about setting, how important is place and setting to you, Clare, when you're writing?
It is very important. Sometimes it is sort of integral to the story. In the case of Hostage, it was always going to take place on a plane. And then other times in After the End, that's a story that is pretty universal, and it was important to me that it felt universal, that we could all imagine having to make a life or death decision about a loved one. And so when I was thinking about where to set it then, that was more about making it sort of feel relatable. So for the UK settings, I chose somewhere quite suburban, somewhere quite small, not London. I have a bit of a sort of an annoyance with books that are set in London just for there's a lot of stuff set in London. And if it needs to be there, so I See You, again, needed to be in London, it's set on the Underground, but actually a lot of books aren't, but they're set there because we feel that's like, the metropolis. But I wanted to set it outside of London. And then the American location in After the End was the same. I didn't want it to be New York. Chicago felt like a really good sized city to choose, and I had a great research trip there and ate lots of pizza.
And it's also that thing that the characters, again, ordinary people, put in difficult or unusual circumstances, isn't it? It's very relatable, no matter where you live.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I hope you've got plans for when you are able to travel to be able to come to Australia.
Oh, I would absolutely love to come. So I'm really in the hands of my Australian publishers, as to whether Hachette Australia wants to bring me over. And they would bring me over if they felt people wanted to see me. So for anyone who's in Australia,
of course, we want to see you.
Then what people can do is they can ask their bookshop to ask the publishers, or they can ask literary festivals in particular, who often if there are lit fests who do have overseas authors, then write to them and say this is that we'd really love to see Clare Mackintosh, because that's why they would then put together a tour. But yeah, I'd love to come.
As a committee member for Sisters in Crime Australia, I'm definitely going to get onto the email tomorrow. We want you.
Great, it's a yes from me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great chatting to you. Do you want to tell people how they can follow you and sign up for your newsletter and things like that?
Yeah, sure. So if you don't already follow me online, then the easiest way to do it really is just to put Clare Mackintosh Facebook or Clare Mackintosh Twitter into your search engine, and you'll end up with me. I'm on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook far too much. My website is claremackintosh.com, and you can sign up to my book club on there, and you'll receive an email that sort of tells you how it all works. But follow me, join me, chat to me, because I love meeting everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much, and hope we get a chance to talk to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. You are definitely on my list of saying yes to.
Thank you.
So it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, and thanks everyone who joined in.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.